Well, once again, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for prioritizing us over Springwatch tonight for the webinar this evening from Rick. So as I say, we're pleased to welcome Rick Battarbee tonight, who's very kindly offered to talk to us all about both pond restoration and creation, and describe the methods used in the Addingham Environment Group's work to create wildlife ponds in local gardens and allotments. First of all, I just want to introduce you to those of us who are on from the Yorkshire Rewilding Network. And for those of us who don't know us, we actually have two of us here from the committee. Those who've been on before will notice a change of face from our regular lineup. I'm the regular so far, however, I'm John Hartshorn, and we have Jessica Penrose facilitating the question and answers tonight. As usual, as you can see as well, we're using Zoom. So just to reassure you all, you are all on mute and all of your videos are turned off. We can't see you. We do take questions during the webinar. So if you want to pose any questions, the Q&A tool is the one to use. So if you want to pose questions, Jessica's actually going to monitor those throughout Rick's talk, and she'll facilitate those at the end of his presentation. Now, just briefly before I hand over to Rick, there will be some of you who have not been with us before, and I just want to let you know, and for those who are familiar, just give you a reminder that we have a fully operational website with a growing amount of content on there. We also have our Twitter feed, and the whole background to the network is that it's a registered charity that was launched on the 1st of August last year by initially a very small but now growing group of volunteer committee members and additional volunteers. And the aim really is just to bring together anyone across Yorkshire who has an interest in rewilding at a range of different scales and from really right along the rewilding spectrum. And the intent is really to inspire one another, share knowledge, experience, and connect people with each other as well. And generally just all try and do our bit to help Yorkshire develop into a much more nature-rich and more sustainable region overall. Now, we've run a series of monthly webinars from October last year. And after tonight, I think it's probably time to take a bit of a pause with the lovely sunny weather and light evenings that we should all be enjoying from tomorrow night onwards. But we will be looking at bringing back a program of webinars once the darker nights cut in the autumn time. We'll, as usual, publicize all the events through the website and via Twitter, and of course in the newsletter and mail shots, which I hope you subscribe to. So do keep an eye out for those throughout the summer. If you're not yet signed up for the newsletter, then you can do so via the Join Us page on the website. And there's also a contact page in there if you've got any suggestions for us as well. And of course, if you are a Twitter user, you can join about so far 740 or so other followers of the network on Twitter. One of the big developments we do have coming, and this is new since I talked through this on the webinar last time, is we do have the Yorkshire Rewilding Forum that's in the final stages of testing at the minute, and we hope to go live relatively soon. So again, keep an eye on Twitter and anything that might be coming into your mailbox about this. But it's certainly going through testing at the moment and should be a really good resource once we're able to launch it. And that brings me to the usual call. If anybody has any topics you'd like to potentially present to the network as a future webinar, or produce a story or a project report for the website, do please get in touch. It doesn't really matter whether you're a rewilding landowner or a farmer who's putting more nature-friendly measures in place to improve ecology on the farm, or perhaps you're from another conservation organization or charity, maybe a community group, or even a student or an academic researcher. We'd certainly love to hear any ideas you've got and any topics you'd like to talk about. So do please get in touch and drop us an email to the info@yorkshireRewildingNetwork.org address. On the same vein, we've started a guest blog on the website, which also goes into the newsletter. We'd love to hear short writings from you relevant to the subject matter of rewilding. So again, just please get in touch if you'd like to contribute a small log. And it doesn't have to be a written thing. You'll notice the first one was actually sound recording of the Dawn Chorus. And my usual call to action, we are a charity. We run this presentation as a group of volunteers. We have relatively low running costs at the minute, but any donations that anybody can see fit to make really do help us with those running costs. So if you are in a position to provide a small donation, we've got the donate page on the website, and click of a button and you're all done. So that kind of brings me to the end of my bit and ready to introduce Rick. So Rick is a freshwater ecologist who is Emeritus Professor of Environment Change at University College London and a former director of the UCL's Environmental Change Research Centre. Now, ecologists never really retire, but in what he has convinced himself is retiring, he now lives in Addingham, West Yorkshire, and coordinates the work of the Addingham Environment Group that was formed in 2016. So Rick, I can see you there and raring to go. Are you happy for me to end my screen share and hand over to you?
Okay. All right, thanks very much, John. All right, thanks, John. Thanks, Jess, also for the invitation to talk about ponds to the Yorkshire Rewilding Network. It's not a talk I've given before, so you have to bear with me. So let's start at the beginning. What is a pond? It doesn't really matter too much. I think we all know that they're small, and this is a definition by Jeremy Biggs. We'll be talking about Jeremy a little bit later on. He says more than a square meter and up to 2 hectares in area, permanent or seasonal, could be artificial or natural. And then Carl Sayer, a colleague of mine, will be talking quite a bit about Carl later on. Again, small, shallow, fresh, still, up to 100 meters across, again, permanent or temporary, lasting for only a few months in a given year, if they're temporary. Well, before we get started, just a little bit of history. It might be a surprise that academically ponds have not been as well studied as they might have been. There've been the kind of poor relation of in freshwater ecology of lakes, bigger lakes, and river systems. And it was in the 1980s when a few people began to realize that ponds were actually being lost from the landscape, and we really needed to know much more about their ecology and biodiversity. Estimate at the time was that there'd been over 1 million ponds at the end of the 19th century. And by 1990, the numbers had shrunk to less than 400,000. So the pioneers in pond research was Jeremy Biggs, who's still based at Oxford Brookes, and he formed with colleagues Pond Action in 1988, and they conducted a whole range of different studies, but especially this large study focusing on lowland ponds, the Lowland Pond Survey in 1996. Pond Action became Pond Conservation, and now it's actually the Freshwater Habitats Trust that was formed in 2013. It's essentially a continuation of that same group researching ponds across Britain. Jeremy Biggs wrote a review paper in 2005, which was really quite influential. Here's the paper, 15 Years of Pond Assessment in Britain, Results and Lessons Learned from the Work of Pond Conservation. And it was this report that led to ponds for the first time being included in this major countryside survey that the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology conduct at repeated intervals. And they reported in 2007, you can see the cover there of that report, and the URL at the bottom gives you the link to it, and you can download and read that report. But that was the first national pond survey, and it included upland as well as lowland sites. It talks about the number and type of ponds in Britain. It examines for many ponds the physical and chemical condition. They look at biodiversity and biological quality. That essentially means surveying not just the invertebrate populations that they'd been looking at in the previously, but also the aquatic plant populations as well. Talk about creation of new ponds and the loss of ponds from the landscape. And a really important conclusion was, maybe surprisingly, maybe counterintuitively, that ponds were indeed exceptionally important centres of biodiversity. So a lot have been lost, and many that had not been lost were in poor condition. So what kind of ponds do we have? It's a full range. We can all think of the different kinds of ponds. A lot of the ponds of concern and of interest are farmland ponds. This is one in Norfolk, and a pond that would have been previously used as a marl pit. Then there are upland ponds. In Yorkshire, we've got lots of these up in the moors. This is one I've worked on professionally, actually, near Robin Hood's Bay on the North York Moors. I think this was originally a peat cutting, so it's a flooded peat cutting, quite different, clearly, from those lowland, richer, more alkaline ponds. This is an upland acid pond. Here in Addingham, we've got some medieval fish ponds. There's lots of those around the country. Here in Addingham also, we've got a mill pond, lots of mill ponds, some of them going back to the Middle Ages, but a lot from the 19th century when they were created to drive water wheels for the early industry. And one here I've just popped in. This was only created a couple of years ago. This is created by Jack Hurst of the Yorkshire Dales Rivers Trust in Bishopdale in North Yorkshire, and this was part of a natural flood management scheme. So ponds are being created to slow the flow of water into the rivers and further down into the lower reaches of our river courses. And then I'll come back to this right at the end. This is our back garden, and this is a wildlife garden pond acting as a rain garden pond. And this is just about a week or so ago, and you can see it really is a rain garden pond. So what do we find in ponds? They're fantastic for aquatic plants. There's lots of invertebrates, good for dragonflies, good for beetles, amphibians, especially frogs. Our pond at the back there has got enormous quantities of newts. Birds visit the ponds, particularly the grey wagtail. But there's also rare species in ponds too, famously the great crested newt here, and in lots of ponds in East Anglia, or they should be, but more rare now than they used to be, the crucian carp. So what are the threats to ponds? Why have we lost so many? Why are so many in poor condition? Well, the first thing to point out is that many of them have just been infilled by farmers. And you can see on the left here what looks like a ploughed field has got some surface water there. And in fact, there's a pond underneath there. But we've lost ponds, not just throughout the UK, but also throughout much of Europe. There's a concern about ponds across Europe. And what happens when we lose ponds to what we call the pondscape is that the distance between ponds becomes greater, so the habitats become fragmented. And ponds then are not so useful to act as stepping stones across the landscape for species dispersing. This is a particular concern, of course, with climate change when conditions are changing and species need to migrate and use these stepping stones to get to more environmentally appropriate climates. Reason why so many have been infilled, probably since the Second World War, in the drive for farming efficiency, increasing crop production. And in some cases, farms now have mains water supply and ponds don't need to be sustained to provide drinking for livestock. So as you can see here, in many cases, agricultural ponds just filled in and all you can see is a damp depression or a crop mark. I'll come on to these in a moment, but these what my colleague Carl Sayer calls ghost ponds, and they can be re-excavated and brought back to life as we'll see. The next problem, the issue is what we call terrestrialization, and this is just allowing ponds in the landscape to become overgrown. And many ponds since the 1970s and 80s have become overgrown. A research project in East Anglia shows that ponds were kept open in the past to provide watering for cattle and horses. Often they were used for local people for fishing, particularly crucian, carp and tench. Trees were managed often for firewood and kept the amount of trees and woodland around ponds reduced. Even apparently some trees were kept under control as a form of pest control against brown rats. And also in this project, it was revealed that quite often farmers would ask their farm labourers to manage these ponds, in fact, to give them work to do during a quiet time of the farming year. So as a result of that process, ponds become overgrown by scrub. The water, as you can see that bottom left-hand corner there, has become very shallow with muds lacking oxygen, often dominated then by decomposing leaves and branches, generally in poor shape and with poor species diversity across all different biological groups. A key threat to ponds is also eutrophication. This might be one of the main problems for ponds generally, not just in farmlands, but elsewhere too. And eutrophication is a nutrient enrichment by nitrogen and phosphorus. In farmland, it's caused by fertilizers and livestock manure runoff into water bodies. Urban areas, we get eutrophication from surface runoff from impermeable urban surfaces. And often in gardens, we get very rich garden ponds because many people use tap water to fill their ponds or to top up their ponds. And we know that tap water in most parts of the country is very rich in phosphorus. And of course, it leads to abundance of algae. In ponds, it tends to be filamentous algae, in particular this one here we call blanket weed, Cladophora glomerata. And as the algae decays in the water, then it can lead to very poor oxygen conditions. And if you have decomposing algae in water using up oxygen, then that oxygen can actually, that lack of oxygen can lead to reducing conditions in the pond, which recycles the nutrients back from the muds back into the water column. And because there's very little flushing in ponds, in fact, it means that this high concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus is maintained and often very difficult to reduce. So the important thing is to try to reduce the nutrient loading in the first place. It's very difficult to otherwise to stop eutrophication. The only thing you can do then is just to sort of keep on removing the blanket weed and manage it as carefully as possible. The other technique is to make sure that there are submerged plants which are competing for nutrients with the algae. And then another most important issue is the problem of invasive species. And one of the ones that's of real concern is this New Zealand pygmyweed, Crassula helmsii. And here's one of my former colleagues, Ben, there standing in a pond surrounded by this by Crassula. As far as I know, we don't have that in Wharfdale. We certainly don't have it close by in Addingham. But what we do have as an example is this curly waterweed, Lagroscyphum major, which is a problem on one of our golf courses here in the village. And I'll come back to this right at the end as well. And we've been helping the golf club to try to remove it. It's going to be a long-term task, but you can see that top left, in fact, it just covers pretty much the whole surface, the whole water column of the pond. And there, bottom left, we've been pulling it out and piling it up on the edge. There's a close-up of it in the middle there, and that's our worthy group of volunteers, in fact, having done a good morning's work. So what we're concerned then is increasing the number of ponds, that would be pond creation, and improving the condition of ponds that we have, and that's what we would call pond restoration. And I'm going to talk first about pond restoration, and it's mainly the work of Carl Sayer. I've mentioned before that one of my UCL colleagues, and his work has been mainly focused in Norfolk. And then I'll talk a little bit about pond creation and the Million Ponds project by Jeremy Biggs, the one on the right there at the bottom, who leads the Freshwater Habitats Trust that started life as Pond Action. So in pond restoration, what are the principles? This is what Carl would argue: we need clean, clear ponds, buffered from the runoff and fertilizer inputs from surrounding agricultural land. He's talking about farmland ponds here. We need sunny and shady ponds, but most ponds are shady, so quite a lot of ponds need to have woody vegetation removed to let light get into through the canopy into the water and down into the water column. He points out that not all ponds need restoration. In some cases, ponds have started to terrestrialize and moved from being in open water condition to produce interesting bog and fen habitats, which in fact need to be conserved in their own right. So we shouldn't be actually have a problem of green on green where we're removing really valuable biodiversity to actually create a different kind of biodiversity. So we do need to understand pretty much what we're tackling to start with. Then all shapes and sizes, the more variation we can get in shape and size and depth, the more habitats, the more microhabitats we create, and that's obviously good for biodiversity. And then this is something that works really quite well. Many people see a pond that's being created or being restored and think that then species need to be added. By and large, they just need to be left to their own devices because natural colonization will take place. And in particular, Carl says don't bring in plants from garden centres and nurseries, particularly if there's a problem of bringing in invasive species. And then it's clearly important to think about ponds which are not just nature ponds, but also in fact have cultural and heritage interest, and to make sure that we only restore the ones that really need restoring. So the two techniques that he's been using is one to actually remove woodland from the riparian zone of the ponds, and the other end is this idea of re-excavating ponds where they've been infilled. He's had a number of PhD students. In fact, he still has PhD students working on different aspects of pond ecology in Norfolk. This was a map put together by Emily Alderton back in 2013 at the start of a PhD. And this was just using Ordnance Survey maps to map out the distribution of ponds in Norfolk with 22,000 ponds there. So you can really call this a pondscape. And many of the ponds look like this. On the left-hand side, this is hiding a pond. It's just become overgrown by woodland. And on the right-hand side, again, you can see the branches just across a muddy, wet surface there. This is called Hayden Pond, as it was in 2016. Importance of shade is illustrated here. Again, this was part of Emily's PhD, and she was surveying amphibian populations in ponds with different amounts of woodland cover. And you can see on the left-hand side there that the ponds that had less than 20% shade, in fact, had the highest number of amphibians. And on the right there, you can see a very low number of amphibians in the ponds that are heavily shaded. So something like 30% perhaps of a pond needs to be wooded, but more than that, then it probably does restrict wildlife population. And their technique is to remove carefully much of the woodland, leave about 25 or 30% there, in some cases then dredge out some of the anoxic black mud that's accumulated as a result of the pond being overgrown. And here then are pictures which shows that sequence. The top two there, the ones I just showed a few slides ago, A and B, but at the bottom, a year later, 2017 on the left, and then 2 years later, 2018, you can see very, very quickly this pond looks like it's been there all the time and has become a wildlife, or becoming a wildlife rich pond. So then coming to what Carl calls ghost ponds, his Ghost Ponds project, trying to identify where ponds used to occur in the landscape, looking at old maps, and then trying to recognize where they occurred in the field. And you can see these damp patches. The one at the bottom is the one I showed before, but there's 3 other examples there where ponds used to exist. And again, a lot of this can be done by mapping. Emily's PhD again on the right-hand side, a field pattern, and the small red dots there are ponds that occurred on the Ordnance Survey map, 3rd revision just before the Second World War, but have since been lost. And she selected, I think, 3 ponds in her PhD to excavate. And the one here is called Guestwick. See the map on the left there at the top is the old map there with a red circle around it. And at the bottom, you can see the 2014 map. The field boundary down the middle has been removed, so that's a much bigger field now. And that pond where the circle is has been lost. So finding that pond on the ground, here it is, measuring it out. And then what's really quite fascinating is that many of these ponds, these are old ponds, they've accumulated sediments whilst they were open water ponds, and then they've been filled in with soil on top. And you can see from this trench, the black stratigraphy there showing the former pond. And the trick here is to only remove the soil, the infill soil, very, very carefully, and fill with water, and then expose the water to the original muds below, because the muds below contain viable propagules of eggs and seeds. So here's the work in the field, an excavator digging, re-excavating the pond. And this is September 2013 with Emily in shot, pond sediments to the right there. And 2014, just a few months later, this is what it looked like. And then September 2014, a year later, you can see this has already begun to be colonized. And this looks like a lot of Potamogeton, which has come into the pond, but it's not coming from outside. It's come into the pond because old seeds have germinated from the sediments. And in July 2017, just 4 years later, this is what it looks like, a really superb wildlife fond full of plants and animals. And then in a PhD, just to show the extent to which the old muds did contain viable propagules. This is a paper she published in Biological Conservation in 2017, but there's a lump of the mud. You can see old shell remains, but there's lots of other things in that mud that you can't see. And she then set it out in the lab, and you can see from the bottom right-hand picture there, the germination of charophytes and pond plants successfully from that chunk of mud. So what about the outcomes from this kind of work in Norfolk, from the Norfolk Ponds Project? This increase in the number of wetland plants, comparing 30 restored ponds on the left there and 10 control ponds on the right. And so on the left, on the bottom left-hand corner, that's the number of species per pond, less than 5 before the restoration. And then, as you can see, years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 since restoration, a gradual increase in the number of ponds, in number of plants, getting up to 20 species or so in some cases. and in the control ponds, overgrown ponds, only had retained those 4 or 5 species. Then amphibians, again, another good indicator of success. This is looking at before and after 2013 to 2017, looking at frogs, toads, smooth newt, and GCN. GCN is obviously great crested newt. So you can see in all cases a big increase in the ponds with different species of amphibian, particularly newts. And the great crested newt, rare species, this shows how populations of great crested newts have increased over the last, over those few years as a result of this restoration program. So here's before started the distribution in 2010, and then 2012, 2014, and 2018 as these ponds were restored. So some terrific outcomes from this work, proving that old ponds can be restored, that old ponds can be re-excavated, and showing that there are very, very positive responses from wildlife, not just aquatic wildlife, but where ponds have fringing buffer zones, then there is a combination of aquatic life and terrestrial life. Carl has had a number of PhD students looking at the response of invertebrates. One PhD student, Richard Walton, looked very much at the attractiveness of ponds and pond margins for pollinators, looking at moths and butterflies and hoverflies, and just showing how rich the pollinator population had become. And another interesting finding, again from a PhD student, showing a tremendous increase in farmland birds and in bird populations. And that's because ponds are extremely good in hatching invertebrates, particularly chironomids, which provide excellent food, insect food for birds. So there's a whole range of positives if in fact ponds are restored, well, as this fantastic picture shows, with a buffer strip around the edge, giving that large range of habitats. So let's turn then to pond creation. I know less about this program, except it hit the headlines back in the 2007, 2008 or so, because as a result of that 2007 pond survey that I mentioned at the beginning, that was organized by Pond Conservation, there was an enormous amount of money acquired. I think it was a lottery fund grant, but funds from all kinds of organizations to try to increase the number of ponds in Britain. And it was called the Million Ponds Project, referring back to that second slide I showed, where it seems that there was over 1 million ponds in Britain at the end of the 19th century. So create as many ponds as possible, as many good quality ponds as possible. And that organization, now the Freshwater Habitats Trust, have got a very good website. They've got all their toolkits, all their guides, all their fact sheets are actually available on that website, and there's the address of the website at the bottom. So if you're interested in creating ponds from the very beginning, then that's the website to look for and the guidance to look for. They reported on the first phase in 2012. Here's the report that can be seen and downloaded, I think, from the website as well, bringing back clean water to the countryside. And they describe the Million Ponds Project as a 50-year initiative. It aims to create a network of clean water ponds across England and Wales. And in so doing, they wanted to change attitudes so that pond creation became embedded in land management practices. And their aim was to fund new ponds and pond complexes, primarily at the beginning, and still I suspect, to look after and enhance the habitats for threatened freshwater plants and animals, but also to provide guidance on pond creation, to engage with as many stakeholders as they could, and to provide that information in the publication of pond creation toolkit, and this included toolkits for many of the key rare species listed in the BAPS program. Certainly raised the profile of ponds with policymakers and the media, and I'm not quite sure just where the program is now, but there was a second phase that was launched in 2012, running through to 2020, and the description of that can also be seen on the website. In the first report, here are some of the outcomes, some of the achievements, and you can see they were really concerned about creating ponds to look after many of these rare BAP species. And so this is a table showing the different species on the left there, the rare ones, and the number of ponds created to take care of those species. So the natterjack toad there, 47 ponds created to look after natterjack toads. Then on the right, numbers, lots more ponds here, and these were to help less rare, more common species. So things like toad and great crested newt and otters. And that report gives a whole range of case studies, and I've just copied a couple of them here. One on the left there, the natterjack toad from the Sefton coast there, where there were 10 new breeding ponds created. And on the right there, ponds created in Radnorshire to benefit the fairy shrimp. It's a elusive invertebrate species which only lives in temporary ponds. So I've been talking about ponds, creating ponds and restoring ponds, but the important thing is not just to think of ponds as individual ponds, but ponds as part of pondscapes, and ponds as part of hydroscapes, as part of landscapes. So here on the left, you can see, again, from the Freshwater Habitats Trust, in the top left there, perhaps a landscape with devoid of ponds, and then how ponds could be positioned in the landscape there to, if you like, to create a pondscape. And we could then survey those ponds. We could look at the species in a pond to calculate their diversity. We call that the alpha diversity. But it's important to have ponds of different kinds across that landscape, as I've mentioned before, across a pondscape. And we can then look at, we're likely to then find many, many more species, because there'll be an overlap in the species between ponds, but across all ponds, in fact, we're likely to have a much bigger species pool. And this is very important because it means that species can move from one pond to another. If there's a problem with one pond, then there are refuges elsewhere. And if a problem with a pond, such as a pollution incident, occurs, then species can recolonize. But also, there's an emphasis these days as well of looking at not just pondscapes, but also as hydroscapes, and how that ponds fit in with lakes and rivers to create a mosaic of connected water bodies in the landscape. And a lot of research going on at the moment, in fact, to look at connectivity between water bodies, to have this integration across a hydroscape, but then also to integrate the wetlands with the drylands, so we create gradients from wet to dry in the riparian zones of rivers and ponds and lakes. And this comes back then to the kind of research in understanding the how to connect systems together, and the problems of connecting systems by either providing corridors on the one hand, or providing water bodies that are sufficiently close together for easy movement of species between them. Having said that, there has to be the consideration that if you connect water bodies up physically, it may be that it leads to competition or invasion by invasive species, or in fact, you bring poor water quality into good water quality. So this is part of the research at the moment, is understanding how to connect water bodies to create a good outcome rather than suffering from problems that might occur. So just an example of this, going back now again to Carl and Carl's work in Norfolk. This is, as you can see, the same map A and B. This is like one of those intelligence tests where they ask you to spot the differences between the two maps, how many differences you can see. It looks pretty much the same, but if you look at the numbers, starting with 1 on the right-hand side there, and this is the current situation. There's an isolated pond on the left that's now being given a riparian zone. And then number 2 there, you can see how that pond there has been integrated and an extra grassland has been added in B there to extend that that site there and to tie that site into other sites. And then under 3 at the top there, another little pond by itself close to a wet meadow area where there's been then a grassland created there to give more habitat range at that particular point. And then at the bottom, this is a river Glaven. You can see how the river corridor there has a riparian zones being created, connecting 4 down through the river Glaven to the habitats down in the right-hand side. So this is now a kind of pondscape, hydroscape, landscape. And then finishing off with work that we've been doing in Addingham with our environment group there. This is Addingham, not a lot of standing waters. There's a big one to the top left-hand side there. That's Chalker Reservoir. It's actually just outside our parish boundary. But within the village itself, we have relatively few standing waters, and not all of them are in particularly good condition. The one that we would really like to have in good condition is called the Sawmill Dam or Sawmill Pond, as you can see here. It's a couple of 100 years old, built to drive a textile mill at the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. Takes water off from one of our becks, and it suffers because it's something we've mentioned already. It's too shaded, lots of trees around it. They could, of course, be thinned out, but probably the main problem is that there's just too many ducks, and duck ponds and wildlife ponds are not compatible, sadly. And I'm sure if anybody's listening here or watching from Addingham, in fact, but I think it'd be difficult for us to remove the ducks without a major village outcry. So I think the Sawmill Pond is going to remain a poor quality, turbid pond with lots of ducks in it for the foreseeable future. We also have a golf course, and it's called the Brackengill Golf Course. And there's a little pondscape because about 20 years ago, when the golf course was extended, 5 ponds were dug, and you can see them there. Most of them are in reasonably condition. The poor one is the one I've circled, which is the one I showed earlier. And that's the one with this invasive curly waterweed, Lagracyphum major, in it. And the story here is it was one of the members of the golf club, once these ponds had been dug, thought it'd be a good idea to get them started, and so apparently tipped the contents of a goldfish bowl into the pond and introduced this invasive species, and it's taken over the pond completely. Whether we can ever eradicate it, I don't know. But it's we pulled a lot out, but there's still a lot left in, and we'll probably need to organise a work party quite soon to go up there and try to remove more of it this year. And then perhaps more exciting, we're working with the local primary school to create a wetland, which includes a couple of ponds. This is a drone image of the school and the school grounds. And you can see in the circle here, this area of the school grounds. It used to be, as you can probably guess, maybe from the shape there, that was the when it was the middle school, that was the high jump pit, and then running off to the right there was the long jump, and these were abandoned about 20 years or so ago, and this is proper rewilding. This site has been rewilding since then, and it's got quite a lot of trees and rough grass, but the area occupied by all the high jump and long jump pits was damp, and we thought it would make a good wetland if we could excavate some of the scrapes and deepen some of the hollows that already existed. So we got some grant money, and we're able to bring in a contractor to create some hollows and scrapes of various depths and sizes. And here again is our volunteer group. This is the old high jump pit. You can see how sandy this is. The sand obviously was introduced. It's not the natural substrate there, creating a fairly large, this would be a wetland scrape rather than a pond as such. But then the old long jump pit, we decided we'd actually put a pond in there, and to make sure that that had water all year round, to create a truly aquatic habitat there. And so we've dug the hole. The bits in the middle, that's the astroturf. When we excavated the high jump takeoff zone, we found about 20 centimeters below the soil level the astroturf that had been used 20 years ago. So we reused that, turned it upside down, and used it to protect the liner. And then we've got the concrete curbstones as well that was on either side of the long jump run up. So we've been able to use all that to create the pond. As you can see on the right-hand panels there, the line is stretched across the basin using the curbstones to anchor the liner, and then water filling the pond. And so that's a permanent pond, and then the rest we've 10 of these wetland scrapes, and these are designed just to go up and down with the water table as the rain rains, or it doesn't. And then we've tried to encourage lots of people to put in garden ponds. We've been putting in ponds on our 2 allotments. This is allotment 4A, and as you can see here, we've just been shaping the pond. We dig it only down to about 30 centimeters or so, sometimes maybe 50 centimeters. It doesn't need to be particularly deep there. Shaping it around the edges so we get a perfectly horizontal flat edge, and then we've been putting rubber liners on it, anchoring the liner down, as you can see here. And then we were doing this in this very dry spell before the recent rains, and so we can only get it started off by using water from one of our water butts to start filling it. It didn't take long once the rain started up a couple of weeks ago, but to fill naturally with rainwater. And then this is one we did earlier on our other allotment. This is the one that Jessica's been taking great care of. This is only about a year old, but we've introduced some kingcups and some other aquatic plants there. So this is taking shape quite nicely. And then I just finish with the picture I showed you before. This is our back garden, looking splendid at this time of year in the rain. And that's a pond that we put in about 6 or 7 years ago. So that's now quite a mature pond now, full of newts, full of dragonfly, nymphs, and it's a really enjoyable pond to watch during the year. So I just finish off that if you're interested in creating ponds, then refer you mainly back to the Freshwater Habitats Trust website. There's the pond book on the left. I think you have to buy that, but in the middle there, creating garden ponds for wildlife. I think that's a booklet that you can freely download. And then just on the right-hand side there's just a little pamphlet that Carl created describing his Norfolk Ponds project. So there we go. That's just a little bit about ponds. I'm very happy to try to answer any questions.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Fascinating stuff. And we have got a few questions, just a little bit of time for questions. So, and I'll start with the one that you're probably most going to enjoy, which is, what is the problem with ducks?
Yeah, that's a problem with ducks. Ducks, if too many ducks, people feed them, that's one thing. And when they feed them, you get a lot more ducks. And then the ducks defecate in the water, but the ducks also feed by diving and feeding off the bottom sediments. And if you're trying to put in aquatic plants there to improve wildlife conditions, then the ducks will actually root out the aquatic plants. As they root out the plants and as they take in snails and other food from the surface sediments, then they disturb the sediment, and then the sediment mixes in with the water column, and the water column becomes very, very turbid. So there's no light penetration. So you have the problem of not being able to establish any submerged aquatic plants. And submerged aquatic plants are one of the keys to creating a successful wildlife pond. Yeah, if you lived in this village like you and I do, Jess, you would know that some people love the ducks. There are other people, in fact, who've got small ponds in their gardens who find that the ducks destroy their ponds, and the only thing to do then is if it's a small pond, is to net them to stop them coming and using the pond.
Great, thank you. And can you just speak up a little bit, Rick? I've just had a request. Speak up a little bit, that's fine. So just following on from that, there's been a question that you've mentioned not introducing plants and animals into ponds, but is this just for wild ponds, or can you buy plants from aquatic nurseries for garden ponds?
Whatever you buy well, it depends on you and what you want for your garden pond. If it's a garden pond, it's entirely within your own curtilage. You're obviously quite free to put in what you want. The most important thing is to know whether you're bringing in native species or non-native species. If you're bringing in non-native species, make absolutely sure it stays in your pond and doesn't actually escape outside your garden. That's the critical issue, because they can become extremely invasive.
And we've also had a question about, is it possible to clean or clear a pond that is having the eutrophication problem? That links to also, there was a question about flushing and whether that's a...
Yeah, it's difficult to flush a pond. That's one of the problems is, in fact, the residence time of water in a pond can be quite a long time. But if it's possible to have rainwater flushing a pond, then that's beneficial. If you've got a large water but storage of rainwater, again, then using that to help to get some through flow is important. If it becomes really too rich completely, then yeah, you can begin to dredge it. You've got to be really very careful doing that, because there's enormous amounts of wildlife in the mud. So you have to find a way of separating out, dragonfly nymphs and newts, in fact, from the mud, and put those into water barrels to protect them, in fact, whilst you actually then get rid of the nutrient-rich mud. The critical thing then is to make sure that you only refill with rainwater or rainbutt water, and not to be tempted to use tap water. In Yorkshire, we have more than enough rain, in fact, to keep our ponds pretty much full. In dry spells, they will evaporate and water level will drop. You shouldn't worry about that. Pond life is quite resilient. And unless you actually have fish that you will need to protect, you can almost let a pond go down to dryness. But in my experience, they very rarely get so dry before it rains again. But you've got to hold your nerve. One of the problems that people don't like is if they put a pond liner in, then as the water level drops down, then the pond liner gets exposed and it doesn't look very nice. But then again, either just hold your nerve and wait for it to rain, or in fact, you can actually disguise the edges of the pond liner by putting some coir plant netting in, or in fact, as I've done in many occasions, is just building up small stones around the edges, in fact, so that when the water level goes down, you see the stones, you don't see the pond liner.
Thank you. And are there any particular plants that you would recommend, just briefly in terms of plants?
The critical thing to get going, if you can, are the submerged plants, because these are the oxygenators, and this is where you've got to be careful you don't introduce the submerged plants that you put in aquaria or in goldfish bowls, because almost always those are invasive species, things like Canadian pondweed. So it's best to try to get hornwort, Stratophyllum demersum, or water milfoil, Myriophyllum spicatum will be the one to get. You can get those from British Bomb Plants websites. There are a number of nurseries that deals explicitly, specifically with native species. So yeah, and then it's a question of putting in things like kingcups or spearwort or brooklime, all the kinds of marginal plants that you can put in shallow water that create habitat around the edges, and give you pretty flowers. The other thing is if you can, is to put in a reed of some kind. The one that I like to put in is called sweet gallingale, which is Cyprus longus. And that then grows as an emergent plant, and that provides then an escape mechanism for damselflies and dragonflies, because the nymphs will then crawl up the vertical stems about a foot above the water, and then they will metamorphose then from the nymph into the adult and fly away. So there's all sorts of reasons for having a good balance of plants, both submerged, sometimes floating leaves like pond lilies, and then emergent species.
Okay, I think we have time to squeeze in just a couple more. One is there a critical time of year for restoring or creating a pond? Is there a better time of year for doing it? And also, is it possible to move a garden pond from one location to another without causing more harm than good? So perhaps you could answer those two together.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I would say the kind of winter period, get ready for the spring if possible. January, February, try to create the water body ready for, if you're lucky to get the frogs coming in February, and then go through the season. But you could create them at any time of year. But it's nice to go with a kind of seasonal pattern. In terms of where to put them, try to put them in the right place to begin with. That's a little bit of skill in that, I guess. I mean, you really need to be putting them where the lowest point where it's naturally wet. Although we did have a case in the village here, I've never seen this before, where one of our friends put in a liner into a pond, and it was so wet that the water table underneath the liner came up and it blew the liner up. So sometimes it might be better to perch them onto slightly drier land, and then use the naturally wet land as an overflow bog garden. And so that's how a rain garden would work. So you can run the rainwater from your roof and from your water butt into a pond. That pond can overflow into a bog garden. And then if you've still got excess water, you can dig a soak away with aggregate in it, and then the water can soak away there. So you're then, you're actually having a second benefit, which is slowing down the flow from urban surfaces and retaining the water on site using a sustainable urban drainage idea.
And just one final point before we finish is, is there somewhere that people can go to for advice? So what's the best place to get advice in terms of managing ponds in a landscape?
Yeah, I mean, the Freshwater Habitats Trust is set up for that purpose. I mean, they've got enormous amount of resources on their website. There are lots and lots of fact sheets. I'm not sure whether they run a service whereby you can kind of email or phone them up. I think they tend to provide information for you to actually digest yourself. Yeah, I think that's probably the starting point, in fact, really. But probably also different wildlife trusts. I mean, the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, I think, have quite a lot of knowledge and skill in terms of creating wildlife ponds. So in Yorkshire, I would have thought the Wildlife Trust, Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, might be a good source of information too. Again, whether they will actually respond to kind of email queries, I don't know. I get quite a few, and I respond the best I can, but I wouldn't encourage too many people to do it.
There's a suggestion there in the chat as well, yes, I think so. We'll finish there. And sorry, any of the questions that we've not been able to answer, do feel free to email us, and we can pass some queries on to Rick. But I will need to wrap up, so I'm just going to now hand back to John.
Thank you so much, Rick. That was just so fascinating, really enjoyable. And apologies to everybody that we've only been able to answer a relatively small number of questions. We have a huge number of questions have come in from this. So what I'm thinking is, once we've got the forum actually up and running, this looks to me like a really good and dynamic topic to gather people around for discussion. And actually, I was just thinking of the sort of the 65, 70 people we've had on the call tonight. You know, if we've inspired just 2 or 3 ponds, that's probably 2 or 3 ponds more than there would have been otherwise. So it'd be really good to hear if anybody has been inspired tonight to go and create a pond. So I think on that note, thank you very much, Rick. That's been most useful, most appreciated. And thank you everybody for joining. Thank you, Jessica, for hosting the Q&A. And with that, I shall let you all head off, and remember to press play from start for Springwatch. So thank you very much. Good night.